And welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin our last topic of the course, Unit 9.8, Institutions Developing in the Globalized World. Our learning objective today is to explain how and why globalization changed international interactions among states. And we will begin with some skill practice today. Here's our standards for the day. Right, and global institutions. So for homework last night, so in class, we begin by going over some possible answers to your homework last night. So you were to read these two documents, and you were given a couple of claims, and you were to use the information from the documents to support said claims. So we go over some possible answers in class, such as this one here. And notice we are pulling from both documents to support this claim, or this assertion. Right, so the claim being the post-Cold War economy was often characterized by increased globalization. And our second claim was multinational corporations often took advantage of the types of economies in various parts of the world. Right, so, and here is a couple of examples using evidence from the two documents to support this assertion. All right, so, and I think for the most part, students have submitted this already. So thank you very much. All right, so we're going to begin today looking at the international system just by looking at some kind of characteristics. Keep in mind that when we're talking about the international system that exists in the world today, this is not something that, that is, new per se. So we find ourselves in the midst of an extremely complex international system that is the result of decades and centuries and even millennia of development to get to the point where we are today. So let's just talk about a few characteristics, right, where we find ourselves today regarding international systems. So the scale of societies, right, of states that exist today, today it's much more complex, much more complex world in which we find ourselves in which statesmen, political leaders had in the past. Right? There's many more players. We've gone from 3 to 4 dozen states in existence, what we would call sovereign states in existence 100 years ago to the point where we're over 200 today. Many more people. We are coming up on 8 billion people at this point, right? And of course, much more power today. And of course, you're talking about more power. You can talk about productive power. We have the capability of producing things in quantities and scales in which were never imaginable, a generation or two ago. But also the destructive capability that we have today, right? So the Cold War is over, but that doesn't mean, nuclear proliferation is not an issue. The dangers and the destructive capabilities of nuclear power has not gone away. And I always like that example of the, just kind of using the British Navy. If you look at the end of the 19th century, the British Navy was uncontested. When you talk about global power and, controlling the seas. And nobody would accuse the British Navy of that today. And even that being true, even with the British Navy being, I guess as far as a world power, a fraction of what it used to be, a single vessel in that current Navy still has more destructive capability than the entire British fleet combined. So just kind of wrap your mind around that and extrapolate out, to think about the destructive capability in which humanity possesses today. All right. One other characteristic that we are dealing with within the international system is this idea that there is hierarchical inequality among states and political entities, and this is a continuity. So I don't think anyone is going to argue, at least not in good faith, that hierarchical inequalities exist among states, right? There's differences in the amount of wealth in which states possess, the amount of power, whether you're talking about military power or soft power that states possess, the amount of resources that states possess, the population size, the physical size, et cetera, right? So, right, it is, there is inequality when discussing sovereign states. Yet, right, one of the major changes that we have seen developing since World War II, and I think this is a developing thing, is that there is a formal equality of states legally. Right, this kind of idea that there is a legal equality amongst sovereign nations. So there is equality in the United Nations General Assembly. Every sovereign state has a seat. Every sovereign state has a voice in the United Nations. There's formal legal equality within international law, especially since 2003. And of course, all 200 plus of those countries in the United Nations, right, they all claim sovereignty over their individual nations. Right, they have boundaries and declare that they have sovereignty of what goes on inside those boundaries. As opposed to the colonial era, right? And these are things that before World War II, before decolonization takes place, was not true, right? So there's an emerging equality, right? At least legally. And also there's when you're kind of looking at where we are today, there's a density of relationships, right? There's a density of relationships that exist within the international system that does not, did not always exist in the past. So today, obviously we have the United Nations, but there's a much more complex array of systems that exist within the international community that goes simply beyond that. So if you, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. When you kind of think about the international system, I always kind of like to stop for a moment and just kind of like to, just make sure we kind of understand the history behind it. How long has the international system been in place for? How long has this been happening? And since the time I opened this, apparently it has frozen. So I apologize. I'm going to have to reopen this thing. All right. So let me shut this down if it will allow me to. I'm going to shut everything down. And let me reopen this. And I just want to run through, some kind of historical examples of how long exactly the international system has been in place for. All right, so reopen. Here we go. All right. So if we're talking about the United Nations, all right, talking about the UN, this is right post World War II, and if I ask students for examples of other examples of systems in which, right, we're talking about the international system, right? We're talking about examples of examples of either just basically transnational agreements, right? And as far as why do they originate, right? Why do they originate? Mutual benefit. Mutual benefit's a good reason. Mutual concern, fear. Okay, and this is generally kind of why we see these things rise. It is in the best interest of both parties or multiple parties to join these kinds of arrangements, right? So we talk about the UN. We also maybe talk about NATO, right? NATO is a collective, all right, collective security. Yeah. Spell here. Okay, it's a collective security agreement or arrangement, right? And of course, we see the Warsaw Pact, or can't spell at all today, so Warsaw right? So we see the Warsaw Pact kind of rise up in response to this, and of course the Warsaw Pact collapses in the in the late 80s, early 90s. But we see NATO continue, right? So the UN exists and NATO also exists, right? So and of course that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? When we start talking about these international arrangements, in Europe, the EU also exists, kind of on top of that, and you kind of see the complexity of layers that we're starting to see here, right? But if we kind of go back in the past, I'll just ask students in class, give some examples of some other transnational agreements that rose up for one way or another. Kids will often mention things like the Allies versus the Axis, Central Powers versus the Allies, either World War I or World War II. Kids will mention things like the League of Nations. Okay, this is that post-World War II creation. I had a kid in class today, bring up the Berlin Conference. Okay, the Berlin Conference, right? So 1884 through 85, right? Great example. And students bring up today, the Congress of Vienna. We'll talk about that one later as well. These are all really good examples, right? So how much further back can you go thinking of examples of this? So I had some students reference maybe the French and the Dutch supporting the United States in the American Revolution. Go back a little further than that, maybe the 7 Years' War, maybe the shifting alliances of the 30 Years' War, resulting in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And you can go back and back and back further, and further, if you will. Because of the limitations of our course, we don't start at the beginning of the rise of the state. So a lot of this early state development we don't really get into. But if I were to kind of think off the top of my head, just a quick and easy, what is the earliest example I can think of? I would probably say maybe the Delian League. Okay, the Delian League would be like a good example of an early example of a transnational agreement that was created because of maybe a mutual concern or a fear, right? So since we don't go back this far in history, the Delian League goes back to the 400s BC. Okay, it is an agreement between Greek city-states. All right, so it's a collection of Greek city-states who agree because of a danger on their periphery, right? A fear on their periphery. This is going to pull them together, right, for their own mutual safety, so that they can pool their money together, right? So, their neighbor who they feared, of course, was Persia. Okay, so their danger, their fear was, or their concern was over Persia. And of course, the Persian Wars had already happened. And one of the realizations that the individual Greek city-states came to is, soldier for soldier, even though they were outnumbered, they felt pretty confident, with that. However, how does an individual city-state build a navy to defend yourself against a Persian fleet, the navy of an empire? And the realization was they could not, right? They could not compete with the financial resources for the building of a navy, right? A defensive navy. So we will see a collection of city-states in ancient Greece get together, pull their money together, and create the Delian League. And this is a collective security agreement similar to that of NATO, right? So we see this, we see these kinds of arrangements going back far into history. All right, since there has been empire, since there has been states, we will see these kinds of arrangements. So this one goes back 2,500 years almost. Okay, so yes, all right. But today, we're dealing with this complexity, right? That exists. And of course, about some of this. We've already gone over some of these, so this should be a little bit of review. As far as that equality of of legal rights that we're starting to see around the world, the ICC is the rise of the ICC is a really good example of something that is kind of working towards that or increasing that, right? And and of course, when we talk about the ICC, you should contextualize why it was formed in 2003 or 2002, excuse me. I've been saying three the whole video. I apologize. Right? So, why was this formed in 2002? So, try to contextualize why we would see the creation of an organization like this. Like, what led to the ICC? And so, just think about what happened in the 1990s. Can you think of a specific example that may have led to the creation of the International Criminal Court? Right, that focuses on persecution of international crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. What happened in the 1990s? So hopefully, right, coming to your mind right now should be a couple of examples, or at least one. Right, hopefully you have at least one thing coming into your mind. Most notably is the events of Rwanda in 1994. You could also, maybe talk about Kosovo in 97, or 2 years before the events of Rwanda. We see what was going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina with Slobodan Milosevic. All right, so these are the events that give rise to this, and of course, as this is being created, we're also seeing the events in the Sudan taking place, in South Sudan taking place, as this organization is being created. So this is one of those things where is it, does it stop genocide from happening? Does it stop war crimes from happening? Obviously the answer is no, but for the international community, right, it does make them feel better about themselves because it does provide a measure of accountability, at least the potential for accountability for said action and said events. All right, so the question then becomes why, what are the weaknesses or the shortcomings? And I do have some of these kind of listed out here, and some kind of examples. If you kind of wanted to scroll what the goals are, what it becomes, what the shortcomings are, there's no shortage of examples of shortcomings when you start talking about the UN. You're talking about Russia and Crimea a few years back. You're talking about what's going on in Western China today, right? And in the Xinjiang province with the Uyghur population, there's no shortage of examples of failures to be able to deal with these. And the question is why? Like why are there failures, right? What are the institutional issues associated with this? And of course, the General Assembly, right, as you're seeing pictured here, and you see up on top of the webpage. Oops, not the right one. I'm dragging over. Right. The General Assembly, right, this does give a voice and a place for criticism. So if somebody wanted to criticize what was going on in a place like Russia or a place like China, this is the forum in which everyone has an equal opportunity to condemn, right? And right, so, but this is not the forum, right? The General Assembly is not the forum, however, for action by the United Nations. Like if you're going to deploy UN troops, which has been done in the past, of course, the Korean War is an example of this, right? But if you're going to deploy, that has to be done within a different structure. This has to be done within the Security Council, and we've talked about this before, but just as a reminder, and especially for you who are not in Model UN, if you're criticizing, Russia, or if you're criticizing China, or any other P5 member of the Security Council, the permanent members of the Security Council, criticism happens within the General Assembly, but action happens in the Security Council, and in the Security Council, each of those permanent members of the Security Council has veto rights. So what can actually be done about, let's just say, a hypothetical example of genocide? You kind of want to run out a hypothetical example of something. maybe you have one of the permanent members of the Security Council targeting a religious group in in its periphery, and they are putting over 1 million people into re-education camps, aka internment camps, and individuals are being sterilized. Women, while husbands are in camps, are being forced to allow ethnically Han Chinese men to move into their bedroom with them. And you have attempts to kind of racially assimilate a minority population, right, into China. Hypothetically, if that were to take place, what could be done in the Security Council? Not much without the approval of said country. So you can't, I'm not even talking about troops, but even things like sanctions and, economic tools cannot even be applied, inside this. And you can say that this is a shortcoming of the United Nations, this veto power exists. That said, however, just kind of looking at this, it is difficult to imagine a China or a Russia being part of, or even the United States today for that matter, being part of the United Nations without this kind of increased level of sovereignty that they receive as a result of this power. And of course, if any one of those major countries leaves the United Nations, then it delegitimizes the entire international order. So, that's not you're not gonna see that disappear. You could make an argument that some countries are more sovereign than others, because only a handful of countries have that veto power, hence making their territorial integrity stronger than the rest of the countries. And this is why you see other countries, such as India, for example, petitioning for that status, right? And this is an interesting argument, why doesn't India have this? It was, you look at population size, right? And you compare it to a country like England or France, who also has this kind of authority, and it's not even comparable. You look at GDP size, what is your measure for this in today's world, right? Should some countries lose it? And of course, this whole thing opens up a very kind of dangerous, slippery slope regarding international order in the United Nations. What is your limiting principle regarding this? And what is the bar you're going to set? And if you don't have a bar and you allow this for every country, then nothing would ever get done. And genocides and war crimes anywhere in the world, nothing would ever be able to happen. So this is there are great challenges to the United Nations. So that said, it's you can look at the United Nations and there's definitely some weaknesses and some issues that are kind of built into the United Nations. However, I think the world is a better place as a result of having it, because it does move society towards a more equal, at least in regards to liberal. In regards to legal means and legal measures. Okay. All right. So that's kind of a little brief about that. Right. So when you're talking about this complexity and density of the international order, so the United Nations has failed, to deal with that hypothetical issue going on, right? So why don't other groups jump in and react to this? So maybe the United Nations is unable to collectively come up with a way to address the issue. Well, why doesn't the Arab League then? This is a pan-Islamic issue. This is an issue within Dar al-Islam. Why don't they step up and deal with the issue? The most populated Muslim country in the world, right? Indonesia is down here. Why doesn't ASEAN, step up and try to address these concerns? So just because there is one failure or one institutional failure to address issues, that doesn't mean some of the other organizations that exist, or if these don't help, then why don't they deal with this through different means? there are a whole host, right? And of course, a very large percentage of global Islam is in the African Union. So why don't they, right, kind of seek redress to their concerns over what's going on in Xinjiang? There's a whole host of reasons, right? Of why, right? A lot of them have to do with economic realities, right? That seem to be more concerning, all right? But just to kind of show you the density of these international organizations that exist, and of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg, all right? All right, so once again, continuing with the international system, let's kind of go through some of the historical periods, and let's not go too far back here. Let's just go back to a couple. All right, so one being the Concert of Europe. All right, so the Concert of Europe refers to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, following the Napoleonic Wars, where we see the major countries of Europe, such as France and England and Russia, and the Habsburgs, Austria-Hungary, Austria, I guess at this point, because Austro-Hungarian Empire was not, still the Habsburgs, I guess. At this point, they decided that they would promote peace and stability within Europe, right? They would guide Europe through whatever troubles, right, would arise. And of course, that gave them the right to insert themselves into the domestic affairs of other countries within this system. But this was viewed as necessary following the realities of what happened during the Napoleonic Wars. And the Concert of Europe runs a pretty decent amount of time, about 100 years. We see the Concert of Europe. But the Concert of Europe did face some challenges, which they were successfully dealt with, like what happens in 1848 around Europe, right? A series of revolts break out in 1848. But there are going to be a couple of destabilizing factors. One is internally with the rise of Germany. So, the creation of the state of Germany, eventually in 1871, right, is going to upset the balance. Is going to kind of reset the balance, if you would. But we're also going to see destabilizing events on the periphery, which will eventually make their way into the system itself. And I guess the rise of Germany is a part of that as well. All right. So, and by this, we're talking about the decolonization process that starts in the 1880s in the Balkans. So the Ottoman Empire begins to decolonize in the 1880s and 90s. And we see then a series of crises will pop up in the Balkans in 1912, and the second war in 1913, which will eventually then bring right to the center, not just the Ottomans, but also kind of the pan-Slavic protection of Russia and the Habsburgs who are there already interjecting themselves and have been for decades previous to this. And this instability on the periphery will eventually entangle the entire system and take it down. All right, hence World War I, the Great War. And then following World War I, we see a new attempt at the international system, during the interwar years. And this is the period of the League of Nations, right? So following the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, we see the rise of the League of Nations, but this is a period also marked by the decline of European power and global instability. This is the beginning of decolonization of Europe, right? And we see a lot of destabilizing factors and events taking place in South Asia, in Egypt, right, places like that. And we see attempts by two powers to, in the vacuum that is now being created by this process of shedding off imperial power. You're going to see two powers, one on each side of Eurasia. Germany and Japan will rise and try to fill that void and create empires of their own. And this will eventually result in World War II. All right, and then following World War II, this is that period of time known as the Cold War. And, when you're talking about the Cold War, these are the bipolar rivalries that exist between, the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. And, and we're talking about hegemonic influence politically, economically, culturally, and in Europe, this formalizes into pretty clear lines. And, in learning about the Cold War through a European perspective is a pretty clear-cut thing. However, neither side of the Cold War, bipolar, competition or challenge, really gained a lot of permanent ground in the places that were colonies, right? So as colonialism eventually comes to an end and we go through this process of decolonization, there's going to be attempts at influence in places like Africa and Asia and former colonies, right, like Latin America. However, it's not like Europe, and you will see individual states asserting their new sovereignty to pick and choose the kind of aid and the kind of relationships that they want to develop with the two big powers on their own terms, right? So both will fail, right? To really bring in these new powers. Right. In the end of the Cold War, this ends the last reliable narrative of our course, right? In order to have a true narrative, you need a clear beginning and a clear end. And the Cold War provides that to us, right? So things wrap up in, I guess it's not that clear because I guess you could debate it's 89 or 90 or 91, right? Right. But, when you start looking at the post-World War, the post-Cold War world, right? We don't have a clear end, right? We know it's globalization. We kind of have a term for it, just like during the Cold War, we called it the Cold War as it was going on. Right? So we know that we're in this era of globalization, but we don't know where it's going to end and when it's going to end, and who knows? Maybe it's already, it's already on its way out. And we need to concede that might be the interpretation, a generation from now. But we need to look for patterns, not to predict the future, but maybe to anticipate some things that might come. But these are simply anticipations. So I remember, in the 1990s, kind of thinking about this thing and who would be the next global hegemon or to rise up to challenge the United States. And I remember thinking Europe, or specifically the EU, would be a natural one to rise, and the preconditions seemed to be there through the 90s. Even with its own issues in the Balkans. But by the time we get into the first year or two of the 2000s, we saw the advent of the euro. Europe seemed to be moving towards a more unified system. And maybe they would kind of rise, to become at least a competitor, not necessarily an enemy per se, but a competitor to the United States. However, the events of the last decade and a half or so have largely shown Europe to be kind of going into a different direction. All right, and when we talk about China, when you look at the United States after 89 or 91, whenever you want to say the Cold War came to an end, there's no doubt that the United States was the last superpower standing. We had an unprecedented military power. Our technological military capability was second to none through the 90s and early 2000s. All right, and but China has beginning in the early 2000s began to shift their military focus. Right, so they've always had an army. And largely being concerned with regional issues, right, regarding that, like their involvement in the Korean War, their invasion of Vietnam in the late 70s, or the mid 70s, and and they largely were, the invasion of Tibet, right, and occupation of that, a series of different border skirmishes with India. They've had an army that largely was contained to the region and really weren't considered to be kind of looking for international or transnational influence. However, in the early 2000s, they began to shift their attention to the building of a navy. And a navy is a way to project your power, right? And we see, you want to draw a historical parallel. Maybe this is similar to the German decision in 1898 to build their risk fleet. No one's going to argue that or make the claim that the Chinese Navy is comparable to the United States Navy. However, after more than a decade of building this navy, it is now sizable enough to pose a substantial risk of damaging, and like the risk fleet, in order to dissuade any action by the United States. All right. And when you talk about soft power, right, the United States, has definitely declined regarding soft power, especially since 2003, since the Iraq War. Right, we've seen a decline. No one's going to argue that the United States is not economically powerful. We are still in 2021 the single largest GDP on planet Earth, but we're not predominant. We're not the only major economy in the world anymore. The power of the dollar is not what it used to be. Our national debt is, shocking to many observers. I don't think there's really any other way to describe our national debt issue and its impact on how other countries perceive us, and our influence and persuasion and our diplomacy, have definitely hurt a lot in the last couple of decades from what it was. All right. That said, the United States still ideologically stands for something. And feel free to pause this. I'm just going to kind of go through this. And there is a question about, is the United States favorable around the world? This is a soft power poll. What are your views on democracy? How favorable is this the kind of thing that you want in your country? Right? And these are kind of interesting, right? Interesting to see how different countries perceive, what the United States ideologically represents. Kind of similar to what we talked about with the IMF yesterday, what the IMF represents, right? So if we are the symbol of self-determination, if we are the symbol for a free market democracy that encourages globalization, are these things that you would support in your country? These are some kind of interesting. And we can see today that there is a clear option out there, right? That was not there 20 years ago, right? Nobody would have, realistically put China as a soft power, or a soft power option, when it comes to what the United States believes in. All right. So this is something that that we're seeing change. All right. The global movement and trend towards democracies, which had been on the rise since the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. That upward motion of democracies has stopped and flatlined. And the decline of autocracies around the world has also stopped declining and has now balanced out. And so we're now seeing kind of a parity within the system. And this is kind of an interesting website. So just kind of show you real quick. It's an interactive page, that shows you global democracy. And I have no idea how they come up with this index and what is, what are the determining factors. But it does kind of show you like countries that are most democratic to least democratic in the world. All right. So, where does the United States come on this democracy meter? All right. So this is, based on an index of civil liberties and the such. All right. So we fall number 25. And if you go back over the years, go back to like 2006, right? The United States was, there we are, 17, right? So according to this chart, and like I said, I have no idea what makes this index, what goes into this index, but you can see that we have kind of slid, all right? And you can kind of see where China, right? Where China is on this, 153, all right? So it's kind of a cool little thing to play with, and if we were doing a political science class, then I would probably dig a little bit deeper into that, right? When you talk about soft power, China today is exerting soft power, right? Even within the United States, right? So, and this kind of brings us to the issue of, can the American values, can American ideologies, things like self-determination and democracy, free market economics, can we survive into the future? In the last couple of decades, China never would speak out against, the United States or our prevailing ideology. But the time of silence from China appears now to be done. And we're seeing increasing amounts of, pushback now by the Chinese. They are now pretty open about what they are offering as far as an alternative to values, right? Alternative to what the United States has to offer. All right, so it's kind of an interesting article I pulled off from this Chinese Journal of International Politics. All right, so what is the Chinese value? Marxism, the official ideology, right? Right, so kind of primarily they are offering Marxism, as an ideological guide. They're also offering economic pragmatism, right? And feel free to read through this if this is something that interests you. And also we're seeing a revival of traditionalism within China. Confucianism, which during the Cultural Revolution was targeted for destruction, Confucianism is back, and so now we're seeing a kind of a new China, all right? Regarding beliefs of the olds, all right? All right, so and China is presenting itself as an alternative to the United States, and putting yourself into the position of what we talked about the other day with the IMF. If you want to invest in the infrastructure within your country, you can choose the IMF, which will place conditions on those loans to Western ideological reforms, or there's China now. There's an alternative. So put yourself in the position of someone who is an autocrat, right? And so we're seeing a clear option starting to rise, right? Is it a major threat to the United States today? This is one of those things that you could debate. Okay, I'm simply putting this out there, and it's already out there. So, but irregardless, even with a kind of rising ideological competition, even with a clearly bipolar kind of global ideological frame now coming into light, the United States, right, British, right, we ideologically still represent something even in the world today, right? So here's some images out of Hong Kong, right, during their pro-democracy, right, as China is moving ahead of schedule with their kind of political takeover of Hong Kong, and even places like Iran, places that you wouldn't think, you would see any kind of pro-U.S. stuff. You see amongst protesters, even in countries like Iran, you see in those countries, a clear understanding of what the United States symbolizes. So I pulled this off from Twitter. So I'm just going to let this play. It's pretty short. Oh, yeah. Oh. So we're seeing protesters in Iran, right, kind of refusing to step on the American flag and the Israeli flag, mind you. So I just kind of move up and show you where I pulled this off from on Twitter. This is actually kind of a part of a series of videos. You get a little better angle here, right? Well, some are clearly on it. The majority of the crowd is making their way around it intentionally. So, I mean, it's clear that the ideological frame of the United States is still meaningful in some places around the world and within some movements around the world. Okay? So, all right. So let's kind of just wrap this up today. All right. So organizations such as the United Nations form the stated goal of maintaining world peace and facilitating international cooperation, right? Created after the wake of World War II, right? But limitations of such organizations have continued ineffectiveness, similar to that of its predecessors, the League of Nations. Right. And to wrap up today, so as the United States is a declining soft power, Maybe that will turn around. All right, but one of the things in world history is we need to kind of recognize trends when we see them. And so let's just kind of end today with this an excerpt from the original historian, right? The original historian out there from his history of the Peloponnesian War. So in the summer of 416, a group of Athenian diplomats had gone to Milos to give them an ultimatum, right? Tell them to surrender to Athens and to pay tribute, right? And force them to do the will of the Athenians, right? And when questioned about the morality of this kind of behavior by the Athenians, the Athenian statesman, right, was reported to have said, "Such issues are only in question among equals. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Right? And as you kind of think about that, right, the response from the Melian: "It is in your interest to recognize what is fair and right. You should not destroy what is our common protection, because you are as much interested in this as any. As your fall would be a signal for the heaviest vengeance and an example for the world to meditate upon." Sapriati.